Chapter 14, the Digestive System and Body Metabolism. So your digestive system breaks down the food that you eat into nutrients needed for metabolic processes, such as making adenosine triphosphate, and rids the body of materials that cannot be used, such as fiber. It does this by, we chew, we masticate, that breaks down the food into smaller pieces, making it easier for enzymes to access, and then those enzymes chemically digest the food into nutrients that are actively transported into the blood and delivered to cells around the body. And it's essential for providing the body with energy and the building blocks it requires to maintain life. So recall that ATP is necessary for all cell energy. So proper nutrition is what fuels your body. First, let's just look at the anatomy of the alimentary system or the digestive system. You can break it up into two main groups, and we'll go further into those two groups here shortly, but you have the alimentary canal and then the accessory digestive organs. So the alimentary canal performs the whole menu of digestive functions: ingestion, digestion, absorption, defecation. Accessory organs are things like teeth, your tongue, several large digestive glands that assist in digestion in various ways. And you can see here that the first step of your digestive system is your mouth, and it ends at your anus. But this will be a good photo representation image to refer back to when we're talking about these individual things. So first, let's talk about the organs of the alimentary canal. So as I said, alimentary canal, gastrointestinal tract, the GI tract. So we have the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. In the following slides, we'll break these different areas down one at a time. So food enters the mouth. If food enters the digestive tract via the mouth or the oral cavity, which is a mucous membrane-lined cavity. You have your lips or the labia that protect the anterior opening, the cheeks that form your lateral walls, the hard palate and the soft palate, which is the anterior and posterior roof of your mouth, the uvula, which is a fleshly finger-like projection of the soft palate, which dangles from the posterior edge of the soft palate. Space between the lips and the cheeks externally and the teeth and gums internally is the vestibule. The area contained by the teeth is the oral cavity proper, and the muscular tongue occupies the floor of the mouth. The tongue has several bony attachments. Two of these are to the hyoid bone and the styloid processes of the skull. The lingual frenulum, a fold of mucous membrane, secures the tongue to the floor of the mouth and limits its posterior movement. So you can actually feel your frenulum underneath your tongue. At the posterior end of the oral cavity are paired masses of lymphatic tissue, the palatine tonsils. So we learned about the tonsils a little bit in the lymphatic lecture for chapter 12. The lingual tonsil covers the base of the tongue just beyond. The tonsils, along with other lymphatic tissues, are part of the body's defense system. When the tonsils become inflamed and enlarged, they partially block the entrance into the pharynx or the throat, making swallowing difficult and painful. As food enters the mouth, it is mixed with saliva and masticated, which means chewed. The cheeks and closed lips hold the food between the teeth during chewing. The nimble tongue continuously mixes that food with saliva and initiates swallowing. Thus, the breakdown of food begins before it has even left the mouth. Children, so homeostatic imbalance here is being tongue-tied. So this is just children born with an extremely short frenulum. It restricts movement, can lead to distorted speech. However, it's caught generally much quicker than that because some children will have issues feeding if they're tongue-tied. So it's usually caught a little sooner than when they're already speaking. Next, from the mouth, food passes posteriorly into the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx, which you've heard before, right? Because this is also where air has to go. The pharynx is subdivided into nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. But of course, food stuff should only be passing through the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx. It's not going to pass through your nose. And it's continuous with the esophagus inferiorly. The walls of the pharynx contain two skeletal muscle layers. The cells of the outer layer run longitudinally. Those of the inner layer, the constrictor muscles, run around the wall in a circular fashion. And then alternating contractions of these two muscle layers propel food through the pharynx inferiorly into the esophagus. And we'll talk more about this later, but this propelling mechanism is called peristalsis. Then we have the esophagus, which runs from the pharynx through the diaphragm to the stomach. It's about 10 inches or 25 centimeters long, and it's a passageway for food via peristalsis, that propelling mechanism, to the stomach. So the walls of all of the alimentary canal organs, from the esophagus to the large intestine, are made up of the same four layers, which are the most inner layer is the mucosa. It's a moist mucous membrane that lines the hollow cavity or lumen of the organ. It consists primarily of surface epithelium plus a small amount of connective tissue and a scant amount of smooth muscle layer. Beyond the esophagus, which has friction-resisting stratified squamous epithelium, the epithelium is mostly simple columnar. And then next we have the submucosa, which is found just beneath the mucosa. It is soft connective tissue containing blood vessels, nerve endings, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, malt, and lymphatic vessels. Next, we have the muscularis externa, which is the muscle layer typically made up of an inner circular layer and an outer longitudinal layer of smooth muscle cells. The serosa is the outermost layer of the wall. As half of the serous membrane pair, the visceral peritoneum consists of a single layer of flat serous fluid-producing cells. The visceral peritoneum is continuous with the slippery parietal peritoneum, which lines the abdominopelvic cavity by way of the membrane extension, the mesentery. So recall that when we learned about visceral and parietal serous layers, it's to make sure that the organ is protected and that the cavity of the body is protected, and that those two things are not necessarily connected. They stay in place, but they're not necessarily connected, and it allows some movement between the body cavity and the organ. A mesentery is formed when two layers of peritoneum are fused together. Routes for nerves, blood vessels, and lymphatic vessels are found between the layers. Mesenteries anchor digestive organs in place and store fat, and we'll see that in a couple slides more about the mesenteries. The alimentary canal wall contains two important intrinsic nerve plexuses, the submucosal nerve plexus and the myenteric nerve plexus. These networks of nerve fibers are actually part of the autonomic nervous system, and they help regulate the mobility and secretory activity of the GI tract organs. One of the homeostatic imbalances that might occur is peritoneum infection, also called peritonitis. This is when the peritoneal membranes stick together around an infection site. This helps to seal off and localize intraperitoneal infections initially, which is nice because it'll provide time for macrophages in the lymphatic tissue to mount an attack. So hopefully deterring spread. Now moving on to the stomach. So the stomach is a C-shaped organ, and it's on the left side of your abdominal cavity, pretty obscured by the liver and the diaphragm. So different regions of the stomach have been named. The cardial region, or cardia, named for its position near the heart, surrounds the cardioesophageal sphincter, through which food enters the stomach from the esophagus. The fundus is the expanded part of the stomach, lateral to the cardial region. The body is the mid portion of the stomach. In the body, the convex lateral surface is the greater curvature. Its concave medial surface is the lesser curvature. As it narrows inferiorly, the body becomes the pyloric antrum, and then the funnel-shaped pylorus, and which is the terminal part of the stomach. The pylorus is continuous with the small intestine through the pyloric sphincter or pyloric valve. So at the top, it's the cardioesophageal sphincter. At the bottom, it's the pyloric sphincter. So here in the photos, you're looking at first just the gross anatomy of the stomach, and B is an actual stomach, an actual photo representation of the stomach. In C, it's an enlarged view of gastric pits and glands, a longitudinal view. And in D, you're seeing pepsinogen produced by chief cells that are, which is activated, converted to pepsin by hydrochloric secreted in the parietal cells. So the stomach varies from 15 to 25 centimeters, which is about 6 to 10 inches in length, but its diameter and volume depend on how much food it contains. When it's full, it can hold about a gallon of food. When it's empty, it collapses inward on itself and its mucosa is thrown into large folds called rugae. The lesser omentum, a double layer of peritoneum, extends from the liver to the lesser curvature of the stomach, and the greater omentum, another extension of the peritoneum, drips downwards and covers the abdominal organs like a lacy apron before attaching to the posterior body wall, which we will see on the next slide. The greater omentum is riddled with fat, which helps insulate, cushion, and protect the abdominal organs. It has large collections of lymphoid follicles containing macrophages and defensive cells of the immune system. The stomach acts as a temporary storage tank for food, as well as a site for food breakdown. Because of those longitudinal and circular muscle layers, its walls contain a third obliquely arranged layer of muscularis externa. This arrangement allows the stomach not only to move food along its tract, but also to churn and mix and beat it so that it breaks down into smaller pieces. In addition, chemical breakdown of proteins begins in the stomach. So the mucosa of the stomach is lined with simple columnar epithelium. It produces bicarbonate-rich alkaline mucus that clings to the stomach mucosa and protects the stomach from being damaged by acid or digestive enzymes. This otherwise smooth lining is dotted with millions of deep gastric pits, which lead into gastric glands, which is what we're seeing in C, that secrete components of gastric juice. So, for example, stomach cells produce intrinsic factor, which is the substance needed for B12 absorption. The chief cells produce inactive protein digesting enzymes, mostly pepsinogens, and the parietal cells produce corrosive hydrochloric acid, which makes the stomach contents acidic and activates enzymes. A thin acidic mucus with an unknown function that is quite different from than that secreted by the mucus cells of the mucosa. Still other cells, the enteroendocrine cells, produce local hormones such as gastrin that are important regulating digestive activities of the stomach. After food has been processed in the stomach, it is a thick, heavy cream, and it's called chyme, which enters the small intestines through that pyloric sphincter. So in A, we're just seeing an interior view. You can see the greater omentum is shown in its normal position, covering the abdominal viscera. The sagittal view in B of the abdominal pelvic cavity of a female, and C is conceptualized cross-sectional view of the peritoneum and mesentery. Note that the peritoneal cavity is smaller than represented. It's just trying to give you a better illustration there. Here are just some of the hormones and hormone-like products that act in digestion. So gastrin, which you just heard mentioned, the source is the stomach. The stimulus for secretion is food in the stomach, particularly partially digested proteins. Stimulates release of gastric juice and stimulates stomach emptying. Intestinal gastrin is released in the duodenum, which we'll talk about here shortly. Again, stimulus for secretion is food in the stomach and stimulates gastric secretion and emptying. And then histamine, released in the stomach, stimulated by food in the stomach and activates parietal cells to secrete hydrochloric acid. Somatostatin, which is released in the stomach and the duodenum, with a stimulus for secretion as food in the stomach, stimulated by the sympathetic nerve fibers. So it inhibits secretion of gastric juice and pancreatic juice and inhibits emptying of the stomach and gallbladder. So this would be something that would be released in times of high stress. Right? Times of high stress, your sympathetic nervous system is like, all right, let's focus on the brain, the heart, the lungs, and the skeletal muscles. Then we have secretin, released in the duodenum, with the stimuli being acidic chyme and partially digested foods in the duodenum. It increases the output of pancreatic juice rich in bicarbonate ions and increases bile output by the liver, and inhibits gastric mobility and gastric gland secretion. Cholecystokinin, released in the duodenum with a stimulus of fatty chyme and partially digested proteins in the duodenum. It increases the output of enzyme-rich pancreatic juice, stimulates gallbladder to expel stored bile, relaxes the sphincter of the duodenal papilla to allow bile and pancreatic juice to enter the duodenum. And then lastly, we have the gastric inhibitory peptide, which is released in the duodenum, stimulated by food in the duodenum. It inhibits secretion of gastric juice and stimulates insulin release. The small intestine is the body's major digestive organ. Within its twisted passageways, usable nutrients are finally prepared for their journey into the cells of the body. The small intestine is a muscular tube extending from the pyloric sphincter to the large intestines. It is the longest section of alimentary tube with an average length of 2 to 4 meters, which is about 7 to 13 feet in a living person. Except for the initial part of the small intestines, which most likely lies in a retroperitoneal position, which means it's posterior to the parietal peritoneum. The small intestines hangs in sausage-like coils in the abdominal cavity, suspended from the posterior abdominal wall by a fan-shaped mesentery. The large intestine encircles and frames it in the abdominal cavity. The small intestine has 3 subdivisions: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum, which account for 5, 40, and 60% of the length of the small intestine, respectively. The ileum joins the large intestine at the ileocecal valve. Chemical digestion of food begins in earnest in the small intestine. It is able to process only a small amount of food at one time. The pyloric sphincter, from the stomach into the small intestine, is sometimes called the gatekeeper and controls the movement of chyme into the small intestine from the stomach and prevents the small intestine from being overwhelmed. In the C-shaped duodenum, some enzymes are produced by intestinal cells. More important are enzymes that are produced by the pancreas and then delivered to the duodenum through the pancreatic ducts, where they complete the chemical breakdown of foods in the small intestine. Bile, which is formed by the liver, also enters the duodenum through the bile duct in the same area. And the main pancreatic and bile ducts join at the duodenum to form the flask-like hepatopancreatic ampulla, which is literally translated into the liver pancreatic enlargement. From there, the bile and pancreatic juice travel through the duodenal papillae and enter the duodenum together. So, nearly all nutrient absorption occurs in the small intestine. It's well suited for its function. It has 3 structures that will increase this absorption surface area. So we have villi, but finger-like projections of the mucosa. Microvilli, which are tiny projections of the plasma membrane of the mucosal cells, and then circular folds or papillae circularis, deep folds of the mucosa and submucosal layers. So all these 3 things do is function to increase surface area for increased absorption. Within each villus is a rich capillary bed and modified lymphatic capillary called a lacteal. The appearance of microvilli are sometimes referred to as the brush border because they're tiny little projections. And then, unlike the rugae of the stomach, the circular folds or plicae circularis, they don't disappear when food fills the small intestine. Instead, they form an internal corkscrew slide to increase surface area and force chyme to travel slowly through the small intestine so nutrients can be absorbed efficiently. If they're absorbed too quickly, or the food moved too quickly, we're not going to have chance for proper absorption. All these structure modifications, which increase surface area, decrease in number towards the end of the small intestine. In contrast, local collections of lymphatic tissue, called Peyer's patches, found in the submucosa, increase in number towards the end of the small intestine. This reflects the fact that the remaining undigested food residue in the intestine contains a huge number of bacteria, which must be prevented from entering the bloodstream if possible. So we'll look at a picture of those three things on the next slide here. So in A, you're looking at those, you can see those circular folds, the plicae circularis, that are seen on the inner surface of the small intestine. And then B, this is an enlarged of a villus extension of a circular fold that also contributes to heightened or increased surface area. And then C shows the smaller of the three, the microvilli, an enlargement of that. So even more so, that brush border is increasing surface area for absorption. Now let's talk about the large intestine. It's much larger in diameter than the small intestine. However, it is shorter in length. It's about 1.5 meters, which is about 5 feet long. And it extends from the ileocecal valve to the anus. So from the last portion, the ileum of the small intestine, to the anus. Its major functions are to dry out the indigestible food residue by absorbing water and to eliminate these residue from the body via feces. It frames the small intestine on three sides, and the subdivisions are the cecum, the appendix, colon, the rectum, and the anal canal. The sac-like cecum is the first part of the large intestine. Hanging from the cecum is the worm-like appendix, which is potentially a trouble spot because it can become easily obstructed. It's an ideal location for bacteria to accumulate. Remember, at the end of the small intestine is where all of that lymphoid tissue is, trying to clear out that bacteria, but sometimes the bacteria can end up here, causing inflammation of the appendix or appendicitis. The colon is divided into several distinct regions. The ascending colon, which travels up the right side of the abdominal cavity, makes a turn, the right colic or hepatic flexure, to travel across the abdominal cavity as the transverse colon. Then it turns again at the left colic or splenic flexure and continues down the left side as the descending colon to enter the pelvis, where it becomes the S-shaped sigmoid colon. The sigmoid colon, rectum, and anal canal lie in the pelvis. The anal canal ends at the anus, which opens to the exterior. It has two valves, the external anal sphincter, composed of skeletal muscle, and is voluntary, and the internal anal sphincter, formed by smooth muscle and is involuntary. These sphincters, which act like purse strings to open and close the anus, are ordinarily closed during everything except for defecation, when feces are eliminated from the body. Because most nutrients have been absorbed before the large intestine is reached, no villi are present in the large intestine, but there are tremendous numbers of goblet cells in its mucosa that produce alkaline, so bicarbonate-rich mucus. The mucus lubricates the passage of feces to the end of the digestive tract. In the large intestine, the longitudinal layer of muscularis externa is reduced to three bands of muscle called the tenei coli, or ribbons of the colon. Because these muscle bands usually display some degree of tone, which means they're partially contracted, they cause the wall to pucker into small pocket-like sacs called haustra. Now let's talk about those accessory digestive organs. We have your teeth, the salivary glands, the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. So I think it's pretty obvious the role teeth play in this system, but they're used to masticate or chew by opening and closing our jaws, moving them side to side. In the process, teeth tear and grind food, breaking it into smaller fragments. So ordinarily by the age of 21, two sets of teeth have been formed. The first set is the deciduous teeth or your baby teeth or milk teeth. They begin to erupt around 6 months, and the first teeth to appear are the lower central incisors. The baby has a full set, about 20 teeth or 20 teeth by age of 2. As the second set of teeth, the deeper permanent teeth, enlarge and develop, the roots of the milk teeth are reabsorbed, and between the ages of 6 and 12, they loosen and fall out. All of the permanent teeth, but the third molars, are erupted by the end of adolescence. The third molars, also called the wisdom teeth, emerge between the ages of 17 and 25. Although there are 32 permanent teeth in a full set, the wisdom teeth often fail to erupt, and sometimes they are completely absent. So we classify teeth by shape and function as incisors, canines, premolars, and molars, which you can see in the left part of this picture. The chisel shape of the incisors are adapted for cutting. The fang-like canines, eye teeth, are for tearing or piercing. The premolars, the bicuspids, and the molars have broad crowns with rounded cusps that are best suited for crushing and grinding. The tooth consists of two major regions, the crown and the root. The enamel-covered crown is the exposed part of the tooth above the gingiva or gums, and the crown is covered with enamel, a ceramic-like substance as thick as a dime that directly bears the force of chewing. It's the hardest substance in the body and is fairly brittle because it's heavily mineralized with calcium salts. The portion of the tooth embedded in the jawbone is the root, and the root and the crown are connected by a region called the neck, which you can see now in the left and in the right picture, excuse me. The outer surface of the root is covered by a substance called cement, which attaches the tooth to the periodontal ligament. The ligament holds the tooth in place in the bony jaw. Dentin is a bone-like material that underlies the enamel and forms the bulk of the tooth. It surrounds a central pulp cavity, which contains a number of structures, connective tissue, blood vessels, nerve fibers, collectively called pulp. Pulp supplies nutrients to the tooth tissues and provides for tooth sensations where the pulp cavity extends into the root. It becomes the root canal, which provides a route for blood vessels, nerves, and other pulp structures to enter the pulp cavity of the tooth. So one of the homeostatic imbalances is tooth impaction. So when teeth remain embedded in the jawbone, they are said to be impacted. Impacted teeth can exert pressure and cause a good deal of pain, so they usually must be removed surgically. So wisdom teeth are commonly impacted. When they don't erupt, they're just stuck down there. It can cause pain for people. Salivary glands. So we have 3 pairs of salivary glands that empty their secretions into the mouth. The large parotid glands lie anterior to the ears. So mumps, which most of us are immunized against, is a common childhood disease in which the parotid glands become inflamed. If you look at the location of the parotid glands, you can readily understand why people with mumps complain that it hurts to open their mouth and chew. The submandibular glands and the small sublingual glands empty their secretions into the floor of the mouth through tiny ducts. The product of the salivary glands, saliva, is a mixture of mucus and serous fluid. The mucus moistens and helps to bind food together into a mass called a bolus, which makes chewing and swallowing easier. The clear serous portion is an enzyme called salivary amylase in a bicarbonate-rich juice that begins the process of starch digestion in the mouth. Saliva also contains substances such as lysosome and IgA that inhibit bacteria, and therefore it has a protective function as well. Last but not least, saliva dissolves food chemicals so they can be tasted. So we've heard about the pancreas before. Soft, pink, triangular gland that extends across the abdomen from the spleen to the duodenum. Most of the pancreas lies posterior to the parietal peritoneum, hence its location is referred to as retroperitoneal. Only the pancreas produces enzymes that break down all categories of digestible foods. Pancreatic enzymes are secreted into the duodenum in an alkaline fluid that neutralizes the acidic chyme coming in from the stomach. The pancreas also has an endocrine function, which we learned about in Chapter 9, producing hormones like insulin and glucagon. The liver. The largest gland in our body, located under the diaphragm, more to the right side of the body. It overlies and almost completely covers the stomach. The liver has 4 lobes and is suspended from the diaphragm and the abdominal wall by delicate mesenteric cord called the falciform ligament. The liver has many critical metabolic and regulatory roles, but its digestive function is to produce bile. Bile leaves the liver through the common hepatic duct and enters the duodenum through the bile duct. Bile is a yellow to green watery solution containing bile salts, bile pigments, chiefly things like bilirubin, which is a breakdown product of hemoglobin, cholesterol, phospholipids, and a variety of electrolytes. Of these components, only the bile salts derived from cholesterol and phospholipids help the digestive process. Bile does not contain enzymes, but its bile salts emulsify fats by physically breaking large fat globules into smaller ones, thus providing more surface area for fat digesting enzymes to work on. The gallbladder is a small, thin-walled green sac that snuggles into the shallow fossa of the inferior surface of the liver. When digestion is not occurring, bile backs up the cystic duct and enters the gallbladder to be stored. While in the gallbladder, bile is concentrated by the removal of water. Later, when fatty food enters the duodenum, a hormonal stimulus prompts the gallbladder to contract and spurt out stored bile, making it available in the duodenum. Excuse me. So some of the homeostatic imbalances. So if bile is stored in the gallbladder for too long or too much water is removed, the cholesterol it contains may crystallize, forming gallstones. Gallstones can become stuck in one of those ducts, leading from the gallbladder to the duodenum, causing really terrible pain that people will refer to as a gallbladder attack. Blockage of the common hepatic or bile ducts, perhaps by those gallstones, prevents bile from entering the small intestine, and it begins to accumulate and eventually backs up into the liver. This exerts pressure on liver cells, and bile salts and bile pigments begin to enter the bloodstream. As bile pigments circulate through the body, the tissue becomes yellow or jaundiced. Blockage of the ducts is just one cause of jaundice. More often it results from actual liver problems such as hepatitis, which is an inflammation of the liver, or cirrhosis, which is chronic inflammatory condition in which the liver is severely damaged and becomes hard and fibrous. Hepatitis is most often due to a viral infection resulting from drinking contaminated water or transmitted in blood via transfusion or contaminated needles. And cirrhosis is almost guaranteed when someone drinks alcoholic beverages in excess for many years. It's a common consequence of severe hepatitis. So an overview of the gastrointestinal processes. So major functions can be summarized into 2 words: digestion, absorption. But there are many activities such as smooth muscle activity and certain regulatory events that are not really covered by either term. So in the first image on the left, you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 major events. So ingestion is just food is placed in the mouth. It's an active voluntary process. Propulsion: to be processed by more than one digestive organ, food must be propelled from one organ to the next. Swallowing is one example of food movement, but depends largely on the propulsive process of peristalsis, that involuntary muscle movement that involves alternating waves of contraction and relaxation of those longitudinal muscles in the organ wall. Food breakdown, mechanical breakdown. So physically, fragments break down into smaller particles, increasing surface area and preparing food for further degradation by enzymes. Chewing and mixing of food in the mouth by the teeth and the tongue, the churning of food in the stomach, are examples of processes contributing to mechanical food breakdown. In addition, segmentation in the small intestine moves food back and forth across the internal wall of the organ, mixing it with digestive juices. Although segmentation may also help to propel foodstuffs through the small intestine, is more an example of mechanical digestion than propulsion. And then we have food breakdown and digestion. So the sequence of steps in which large food molecules are chemically broken down to their building blocks by enzymes is called digestion. Then we have absorption. So the transport of digestive end products from the lumen of the GI tract to the blood or lymph. For absorption to occur, the digestive foods must enter the mucosal cells by active or passive transport, and the small intestines is the major absorptive site. and then defecation. The elimination of indigestible, and gut bacteria from the GI tract via the anus in the form of feces. In the second image, you can see the peristaltic and segmental movements of the digestive tract. And the top, adjacent or neighboring segments of the intestine alternately contract and relax, thereby moving food distally along the tract. And B, in segmentation, so this is the movement of the food back and forth. The intestines alternately contract and relax. Because active segments are separated by inactive ones, the food is moved forward and then backward, thus the food is mixed rather than simply propelled along the tract. So here's a flowchart of digestion, absorption of foodstuff. So let's take a little time to review the organic molecules that we first talked about all the way back in chapter 2. So the building blocks or units of carbohydrate foods are monosaccharides or simple sugars. We need to remember only 3 of these that are common in our diet are glucose, fructose, and galactose. Glucose is by far the most important, and when we talk about blood sugar level, we are referring to glucose. Fructose is the most abundant sugar in fruits, and galactose is found in milk. The only carbohydrate that our digestive system digests or breaks down to simple sugars are sucrose, so table sugar, lactose, milk sugar, maltose, malt sugar, and starch. They're referred to as disaccharides or double sugars because they consist of 2 simple sugars linked together. Starch is a polysaccharide, which is many sugars formed by linking hundreds of glucose units. Although we eat foods containing other polysaccharides such as cellulose, we do not have enzymes capable of breaking them down. The indigestible polysaccharides do not provide us with any nutrients. They help move the foodstuffs along the gastrointestinal tract by providing bulk or fiber in our diet. Proteins are digested to their building blocks, which are amino acids. The intermediate product of protein digestion is polypeptides. And then when lipids or fats are digested, they yield 2 different types of building blocks, fatty acids and alcohol called glycerol. Incomplete digestion may preserve monoglycerides and fatty acids. The digestion or chemical breakdown of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats is what's summarized in this chart here. So you can look at this chart to see where the site of action is, the enzymes and the source of those enzymes, and how those are ultimately absorbed. Activities occurring in the mouth, pharynx, and esophagus. So food ingestion and breakdown, and food propulsion, swallowing and peristalsis. So we'll go over the image here in just a second. So food ingestion and breakdown. Once food has been placed in the mouth, both mechanical and digestive processing begins. First, the food is physically broken down as it is chewed. Then food is mixed with saliva. Salivary amylase begins to digest that starch, chemically breaking it down into maltose. The next time you eat a piece of bread, chew it for a few minutes before swallowing it, you will notice that it begins to taste sweet as the sugars are released. Saliva is normally secreted continuously to keep the mouth moist, but when food enters the mouth, much larger amounts of saliva pour out. However, the simple pressure of anything put in the mouth and chewed, such as rubber bands, sugarless gum, will also stimulate release of saliva. So that's sometimes when your mouth is dry, you have a piece of gum, it'll help promote that salivation. Some emotional stimuli can also cause salivation. For example, the mere thought of your favorite food might cause your mouth to water. And all of these reflexes, though initiated by different stimuli, are brought about by parasympathetic fibers in cranial nerves 7 and 9. Essentially, no food absorption occurs in the mouth. However, some drugs, such as nitroglycerin, any kind of medication you put under your tongue for absorption, that will be absorbed in the mouth. The pharynx and esophagus have no digestive function. They are simply passageways. And then food propulsion. For food to be sent on its way from the mouth, it must be first be swallowed. So deglutition, or swallowing, is a complex process that involves the coordinated activity of several structures. So coordinated activity of your tongue, your soft palate, your pharynx, and your esophagus. It has two major phases, the buccal and pharyngeal esophageal. The first phase, the voluntary buccal phase, occurs in the mouth. Once the food has been chewed and well mixed with saliva, that bolus or food mass is forced into the pharynx by the tongue. As the food enters the pharynx, it passes out of our control and into the realm of reflex activity. So the second phase is involuntary. The pharyngeal esophageal phase transports the foods through the pharynx and the esophagus. The parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, so primarily your vagus nerve, will control this phase and promote the ability of the digestive organs from this point on. All routes that food might take, except for the desired route further into the digestive tract, are blocked off. So the tongue blocks off the mouth, the soft palate closes off the nasal passages, the larynx rises so that its opening into the respiratory passages is covered by the epiglottis. So food is moved through the pharynx and then into the esophagus inferiorly by wave-like peristaltic contractions of the muscular walls, again with those longitudinal and circular muscles. So in this image, number one, with the upper esophageal sphincter contracted or closed, the tongue pushes the food bolus posteriorly and against the soft palate. The soft palate rises in two to close off the nasal passages as the bolus enters the pharynx. The larynx rises so that the epiglottis covers the trachea as peristalsis carries the food through the pharynx and into the esophagus. The upper esophageal sphincter relaxes to allow food entry. 3. The upper esophageal sphincter contracts again as the larynx and epiglottis return to their former positions, and peristalsis moves the food bolus inferiorly to the stomach. And 4, that cardioesophageal sphincter opens and food enters the stomach. Activities of the stomach. So we have food breakdown and food propulsion. So the secretion in food breakdown, the secretion of gastric juice is regulated by both neural and hormonal factors. So sight, smell, and taste of food will stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system reflexes, which increase the secretion of gastric juice. In addition, the presence of food and rising pH in the stomach stimulates stomach cells to release the hormone gastrin, which prods the gastric glands to produce still more of the protein digesting enzymes such as pepsinogen, mucus, hydrochloric acid. Under normal conditions, 2 to 3 liters of gastric juice are produced a day. Hydrochloric acid makes the stomach contents very acidic. This can be dangerous because both hydrochloric acid and the protein digesting enzymes have the ability to digest the stomach itself, causing ulcers. However, as long as enough mucus is made, the stomach is protected. The extremely acidic environment that hydrochloric acid provides is necessary because it activates pepsinogen and turns it into pepsin, which is the active protein digesting enzyme. Renin, the second protein digesting enzyme produced by the stomach, works primarily on milk protein and converts it to a substance that looks like sour milk, which is kind of gross. Many parents mistakenly think that the curdy substance infants spit up after feeding is milk that is soured in their stomach, but renin produced in large amounts in infants is the same enzyme used to make milk curdle into cheese. So it's not believed to be produced in adults. Other than the beginning of protein digestion, little chemical digestion occurs in the stomach. Except for aspirin and alcohol, which seem to somehow have a special pass, virtually no absorption occurs in the stomach walls. As food enters and fills the stomach, its walls begin to stretch. At the same time, the gastric juices are being secreted. Then the 3 muscle layers of the stomach wall become active. They compress, pummel, and break apart the food, all while continuously mixing it with the enzyme containing gastric juice so that the thick fluid chyme is formed. The process looks something like the preparation of a cake mix, in which the floury mixture is repeatedly folded in on itself and mixed with liquid until it reaches a uniform texture. And then food propulsion, which is what we're looking at in the image. Once the food has been well mixed, a rippling peristalsis begins in the upper half of the stomach. In picture 1, the contractions increase in a force as the food approaches the pyloric valve, grinding the food into chyme. The pylorus of the stomach, which holds about 30 mL of chyme, acts like a meter that allows only liquids and very small particles to pass through the pyloric sphincter. Because the pyloric sphincter barely opens, each contraction of the stomach muscle squirts about 3 mL or less of chyme into the small intestine. The contraction also closes the valve, so the rest of the chyme, about that remaining 27 mL, is propelled backwards into the stomach before mixing and then processed in a process called retropulsion in 3. So when the duodenum is filled with chyme and the wall is stretched, a nervous reflex called the enterogastric reflex occurs. So this reflex will halt or pause gastric activity. It slows the emptying of the stomach by inhibiting the vagus nerve and tightening the pyloric sphincter, thus allowing time for the intestinal processing to catch up, right? Because we learned that the duodenum doesn't hold a lot of food, thus allowing time for intestinal processing to catch up. Generally, it takes about 4 hours for the stomach to empty completely after the person eats a well-balanced meal, and 6 hours or more for a meal in a high-fat content. So some of the homeostatic imbalances associated with these two processes. So heartburn, I'm sure we've all experienced this. Occasionally that cardioesophageal sphincter fails to close tightly and gastric juice leaks back up into the esophagus, which doesn't have as much mucus production as the stomach, and results in that pain that you feel. If it's uncorrected, it can lead to inflammation of the esophagus called esophagitis. And perhaps even ulceration of the esophagus, which would not be great. A common cause is a hiatal hernia. So this is a structural abnormality in which the superior part of the stomach protrudes slightly above the diaphragm. Because the diaphragm is no longer reinforces the relatively weak cardioesophageal sphincter, gastric juice can flow into the unprotected esophagus. Conservative treatment involves restricting food intake after the evening meal, taking antacids, and sleeping with your head up. Also, we have vomiting, something I also believe we've all experienced, also called emesis. This can occur for any number of reasons. Food poisoning, an emotional response, but it's essentially reverse peristalsis occurring in the stomachs and perhaps in the small intestines, accompanied by contraction of the abdominal muscles and the diaphragm, which increases the pressure on the abdominal organs. And the emetic center may also be activated through other pathways. Disturbance of equilibrium in the inner ear during, say, a plane ride or a boat ride can cause motion sickness and cause people to vomit. Now let's talk about some activities of the small intestine. So we have chyme breakdown and absorption and chyme propulsion. So chyme reaching the small intestine is only partially digested. So carbohydrate and protein digestion has begun, but virtually no fats or nucleic acids have been digested up to this point. Here's where the process of chemical digestion is accelerated, as food now takes a 3 to 6 hour journey through the small intestine. By the time the food reaches the end of the small intestine, digestion will be complete, and nearly all food absorption will have occurred. So that's where most of absorption ends, is through the stomach, all the way through the small intestines to the end of the small intestines. As mentioned earlier, the microvilli of the small intestine cells bear several important enzymes, the so-called brush border enzymes that break down double sugars into simple sugars and complete protein digestion. Intestinal juice itself is relatively enzyme poor, and protective mucus is probably the most important intestinal gland secretion. Foods entering the small intestine are literally hit with pancreatic juice delivered via the duct from the pancreas, as well as bile from the liver. The pancreatic juice contains enzymes that digest all nutrient groups. Along with brush border enzymes, pancreatic enzymes complete the digestion of starch via pancreatic amylase, carry out half of protein digestion via the action of trypsin, chymotrypsin, and carboxypeptidase, and others, and are totally responsible for fat digestion. Because the pancreas is the most important source of lipases, and digest nucleic acids as well via nucleases. In addition to enzymes, pancreatic juice contains a rich supply of bicarbonate ions, which make it very basic. When pancreatic juice reaches the small intestine, it neutralizes the acidic chyme coming into the stomach and provides a proper environment for activity of the intestinal pancreatic digestive enzymes. A release of pancreatic juice into the duodenum is stimulated by both the vagus nerve and the local hormones. When chyme enters the small intestines, it stimulates the mucosa cells to produce several hormones. two of these being secretin and cholecystokinin, CCK, which influence the release of pancreatic juice and bile. The hormones enter the blood and circulate to their target organs, the pancreas, the liver, the gallbladder. Both hormones work together to stimulate the pancreas to release its enzymes. So that's what we're looking at in the image below. In addition, secretin causes the liver to increase its output of bile, and CCK causes the bladder to contract and release stored bile into the bile duct so that the bile and pancreatic juice can enter the small intestine together. As mentioned before, bile is not an enzyme. Instead, it acts like a detergent to emulsify or mechanically separate large fat globules into thousands of tiny ones, providing a much greater surface area for the pancreatic lipases to work on. Bile is also necessary for the absorption of fats and fat-soluble vitamins that are absorbed along with them from the intestinal tract. So what we're looking at in the image is hormonal controls exerted by secretin and CCK, being the main regulatory factors of pancreatic juice and bile secretion and release. So let's talk a little bit about chyme propulsion. Peristalsis is the major means of propelling chyme through the digestive tract. It involves waves of contraction that move along the length of the intestines, followed by waves of relaxation. The net effect of that is that food is moved through the small intestine in much the same way that toothpaste is squeezed from a tube. Rhythmic segmental movements produce local constrictions of the intestine that mix the chyme with digestive juices and help to propel the food through the intestine. And the one notable homeostatic imbalance I want to talk about here is pancreatitis. It's rare but extremely serious inflammation of the pancreas that results from activation of pancreatic enzymes in the pancreatic duct. Because pancreatic enzymes break down all categories of biological molecules, they cause digestion of the pancreatic tissue and duct itself. This is very painful and can lead to nutritional deficiencies because pancreatic enzymes are essential for digestion in the small intestine. Now let's move on to activities of the large intestine. So nutrient breakdown and absorption, propulsion of food and residue, and defecation. So when it is finally delivered to large intestine, the chyme contains few nutrients, but that residue still has 12 to 24 more hours to spend there. The colon itself produces no digestive enzymes. It does have resident bacteria called normal flora or microbiota that live in its lumen, metabolize some of the remaining nutrients, release gases that contribute to things like flatulence and the odor of your feces. About 500 mLs of gas is produced each day, much more when certain carbohydrate-rich foods like beans are eaten. Bacteria residing in the large intestine also make some vitamins, like vitamin K and some B vitamins. Absorption by the large intestine is limited to the absorption of these vitamins, some ions, most of the remaining water. In feces, the more or less solid product delivered to the rectum contains undigested food residues, mucus, millions of bacteria, and just enough water to allow smooth passage. When presented with food residue, the colon begins contractions, but they are sluggish or short-lived. The movements most seen in the colon are haustral contractions, slow segmenting movements lasting about 1 minute that occur every 30 minutes or so. As a haustrum fills with food residue, the distension stimulates its muscles to contract, which propels the luminal contents into the next haustrum. These movements also mix the residue, which aid in further water absorption. Mass movements are long, slow-moving, but powerful contractile waves that move over large areas of the colon 3 or 4 times daily and force the contents towards the rectum. Typically, they occur during or just after eating, when food begins to fill the stomach and small intestine. Bulk or fiber in the diet increases the strength of colon contractions and softens the stool, allowing the colon to perform its function more efficiently and effectively. So homeostatic imbalances. Let's talk about diverticulosis, diverticulitis. So when your diet lacks bulk, the colon narrows and its circular muscles contract more powerfully, increasing pressure on its walls. This encourages the formation of diverticula, in which the mucosa protrudes through the colon walls, a condition called diverticulosis. Diverticulitis is a condition in which those diverticula become inflamed. It can be life-threatening if it ruptures. And then also diarrhea, which is something I think we've probably all experienced, is the result from any condition that rushes food residue through the large intestine before that organ has had sufficient time to absorb remaining water. This can be related to bacteria, infection, etc. Because fluids and ions are lost from the body, prolonged diarrhea may result in dehydration and electrolyte balance, which can be fatal if severe. And then if food residue remains in the large intestine for extended periods, too much water is reabsorbed and the stool becomes hard and difficult to pass. This condition is called constipation. It may result from lack of fiber in the diet, poor bowel habits. By that we mean you feel like you need to go, but you hold it. Narcotic pain medications, and laxative abuse. Stool softeners can help increase water content of material in the colon to ease passage during defecation. The microbiota. So I kind of just mentioned this when I was talking about the large intestine, the bacteria that reside there, that normal flora. So research conducted as part of the Human Microbiome Project suggested that microbial residents, or the microbiota of the human body, could outnumber our cells as many as 10 to 1. Also called normal flora includes all bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungi that live in or on the human body, and this population can vary widely from person to person. In recent years, massive research projects have been ongoing to define what organisms make up the microbiota in healthy individuals compared to those with disease. And data does confirm that these profiles differ. Further study aims to make sense of the microbiome, which is the intersection of the human body, the microbiota, and all of their genes, and our environment along with these factors and how they influence human health. It is estimated that the microbiota contains as many as 10,000 different species. They make vitamins our bodies need, routinely outcompete potential pathogens, and can influence our moods and diets. Furthermore, they influence important aspects of life such as immune system development, energy usage, and allergy and autoimmunity. So there's mounting evidence that crosstalk between resident microbes and the immune system is responsible for healthy immune decisions. This occurs when microbes are able to influence how genes are expressed in cells of the gut mucosa. Several clinical trials are currently underway to develop replacement therapies that would provide patients with healthy microbiota, including microbes that convey protection from food allergies. One of the biggest challenges is how to get the new microbiota established in a gut that already has a microbial population. An understanding of how microbiota influences our health and daily lives is just beginning to be known. All signs point to the importance of microbiota or gut health. It can protect our health and play a role in disease depending on the microbes present. So some of the homeostatic imbalances here, the primary one that we want to talk about is Clostridioides difficile, formerly Clostridium difficile, or C. diff is generally what it's called in a clinical setting. It's just a bacterium that grows in the absence of oxygen. So it's anaerobic, produces toxins and survival structures called endospores, and is most often observed in patients who have damaged microbiota by taking antibiotics. Antibiotics are antibacteria, and they're not necessarily specific to all bacteria, to a certain bacteria. Rather, it might kill your quote-unquote good bacteria. So while antibiotics are super important and save many lives, the CDC estimates 30 to 50% of antibiotics prescribed in hospitals are unnecessary or incorrect. Once the damage is done, however, normal flora will no longer outnumber C. diff, which colonizes the gut and can cause diarrhea, colitis, which is inflammation of the colon, and even bowel perforation and sepsis. The bacterium is extremely difficult to get rid of. Each time these bacteria begin to die, they produce endospores, which are survival structures that even the strongest antibiotics cannot harm. Meanwhile, remaining microbiota are exposed to stronger antibiotics, causing more damage and making it even easier for C. diff to gain the stronghold. It's extremely contagious, spreads easily through contact, Washing hands, isolating ill patients, and using a separate bathroom if possible are all the recommendations to prevent the spread. Despite these precautions, about 1 in 6 patients get C. diff again within 8 weeks. The recurring nature of C. diff and the fact that more than 80% of deaths due to C. diff occur in patients 65 or older have prompted the exploration of new strategies to treat the infection. The most promising treatment option in the face of increasing drug resistance is called FMT, fecal microbiota transplant. While this may sound shocking, transplanting microbiota from a healthy donor to a patient with recurring C. diff infections cures over 90% of cases. After careful screening, donor feces is introduced into the colon in an enema or into the duodenum via a tube inserted through the nose. The rate of FMT success is further evidence that the health and diversity of our microbiota play an important role in our health and well-being. Nutrients and metabolism. So most foods are used for metabolic fuels, aka they are oxidized and transformed into ATP. So remember, ATP is the unit or the substance used for cell functioning and energy. This is very important. So proper nutrition is going to lead to proper metabolic fuel for proper transformation into ATP. Kilocalories or kcal is the unit used to measure the energy value of food. It's also known as calories, which is what we most commonly refer to it as here in the United States. And nutrients is a chemical substance used by the body for normal growth, maintenance, and repair. The major nutrients or macronutrients are carbohydrates, lipids or fats, and proteins. And minor nutrients are vitamins and minerals. So on this chart, this is table 14.2 from your text. It's just showing you the 5 major food groups and some of their major nutrients. So we have fruits, vegetables, grain products, milk products, meats, and meat alternatives. So examples under each. Fruits are carbohydrates and water, include vitamins A, C, folic acid, minerals, iron, potassium, and fiber. Vegetables, carbohydrates and water, vitamins A, C, E, K, B, vitamins except B12, minerals, calcium, magnesium, iodine, manganese, phosphorus, and fiber. So you can see how important a vegetable-rich diet is when you see how many vitamins and minerals it offers us. Grain products, carbohydrate, protein, vitamins, thiamine, B1, and niacin. By only some in the group, water, fiber, minerals, iron, magnesium, selenium. Milk products, protein and fat, vitamins, riboflavin, B12, minerals, calcium, phosphorus, and water. By only some in the group, carbohydrates, vitamins A and D, and meats alternatives. Protein, vitamins, niacin, and B6, minerals, iron, and zinc. By only some, carbohydrates, fat, vitamins B12, thiamine, water, and fiber. Some of you might have encountered this before. So My Plate is a food guide from 2011 that it uses a round dinner plate to illustrate dietary recommendations. It was issued by the USDA, shows categories in healthy proportions and sections of a place setting, in contrast with the segments of the period shown in the 1992 predecessor, or the healthy eating pyramid. So occupying half the plate, we have fruits and vegetables, more vegetable than fruit. The other half shows grains and proteins, more grain than protein. A glass represents dairy, the 5th food group. Links provide details on health choices in each food group. You can personalize My Plate by diet, My Plate diet by age, sex, and activity level at choosemyplate.gov. And nutrition advice is constantly in flux and often mired in self-interest of food companies. So this is definitely something to keep in mind. You know, there are lobbies, there are companies that are invested in the research. Nonetheless, basic dietary principles have not changed in years and are not in dispute. Eat less overall, eat plenty of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, avoid junk food, and exercise regularly. So dietary sources of the major nutrients. So remember, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins. So carbohydrates, except for milk sugar, which is lactose and small amounts of glycogen in meats, all the carbohydrates, which are your sugars and starches we ingest, are derived from plants. Sugars can come mainly from fruits, sugar cane, and milk. Polysaccharide starch is found in grains, legumes, and root vegetables. The polysaccharide saccharide cellulose, which is plentiful in most vegetables, is not digested by humans, but it provides fiber that increases the bulk of the stool and aids in defecation. Lipids. So although we ingest cholesterol and phospholipids, most dietary lipids are triglycerides. We eat saturated fats in animal products, such as meat and dairy foods, and in a few plant products, such as coconut. Unsaturated fats are present in seeds, nuts, and most vegetable oils, and major sources of cholesterol are egg yolk, meats, and milk products. Proteins. So animal products contain the highest quality proteins, molecules that are amino acid polymers. Eggs, milk, fish, most meat proteins are complete proteins that meet all the body's amino acid requirements for tissue maintenance and growth. Legumes like beans and peas, nuts, and cereals are also protein rich, but their proteins are nutritionally incomplete because they are low in one or more of the essential amino acids. The essential amino acids are the 8 amino acids, which you can see in this photo on the right, that our body cannot make. Our bodies cannot make these. Hence, we must obtain these amino acids from our diet. So as you can see, strict vegetarians or vegans must carefully plan their diets to obtain all the essential amino acids and prevent protein malnutrition. Cereal grains and legumes, when eaten together, provide all the needed amino acids, and some variety of this combination is found in diets of all cultures. So things like rice and beans. Soy and quinoa, a seed that is classified as a whole grain, are also sources of complete plant-based proteins. Vitamins. So vitamins are organic nutrients of various forms that the body requires in small amounts. Most vitamins function as coenzymes or parts of coenzymes, meaning that they act with an enzyme to accomplish a particular type of catalysis. So they act as a part of a catalyst. Although vitamins are found in all major food groups, no one food contains all required vitamins. Thus, a balanced diet is the best way to ensure full vitamin complement, particularly because certain vitamins, A, C, and E, appear to have anti-cancer effects. Diets rich in broccoli, cabbage, and Brussels sprouts appear to reduce cancer risk. However, whether vitamins can work wonders is a controversial issue. And then minerals. The body also requires adequate supplies of 7 minerals, which are inorganic substances. These are calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chloride, and magnesium, as well as trace amounts of about a dozen others. Fats and sugars have practically no minerals. Cereals and grains have poor sources. The most mineral-rich foods are vegetables, legumes, milk, and some meats. The section on metabolism discusses the main uses of major nutrients in the body. So that'll be on the next slide. So metabolism is a pretty broad term referring to all chemical reactions that are necessary to maintain life. It involves catabolism, the breakdown of substances to simpler substances, and anabolism, the building of larger molecules or structures from smaller ones. During catabolism, bond energy of foods is released and captured to make ATP, the energy-rich molecule used to energize all cellular activity, including catabolic reactions. So carbohydrate metabolism. Glucose, also known as blood sugar, is the major breakdown product of carbohydrate digestion. Glucose is also a major fuel used for making ATP in most body cells. The liver is an exception. It routinely uses fats as well, thus saving glucose for other body cells. Essentially, glucose is squeezed in a series of rearrangements and chemical reactions, and some of the chemical energy released from this process is captured and used to bind to ADP to make ATP. So adenosine diphosphate to adenosine triphosphate. The carbon atoms released from glucose leave the cells as carbon dioxide, and the hydrogen atoms removed, which contain energy-rich electrons, are eventually combined with oxygen to form water. These oxygen-using events are referred collectively to as cellular respiration. The three main metabolic pathways involved in cellular respiration are glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. The top image we're looking at here is just the summary equation for cellular respiration. And below that is the formation of ATP in the cytosol and the mitochondria during cellular respiration. So oxidation via the removal of hydrogen hydrogen atoms, which are temporarily passed to vitamin-containing coenzymes, is a major role of glycolysis in the citric acid cycle. Glycolysis, which takes place in the cytosol, also energizes each glucose molecule so that it can be split into two pyruvic acid molecules and yield a small amount of ATP in the process. So here you can see in step 1, during glycolysis, each glucose molecule is broken down into two molecules of pyruvic acid as hydrogen atoms containing high energy electrons are removed. Step 2, pyruvic acid enters mitochondria, where citric acid cycle enzymes remove more hydrogen atoms hydrogen atoms and decompose it to carbon dioxide. During glycolysis in the citric acid cycle, small amounts of ATP are formed. And then 3, energy-rich electrons from liberated hydrogen ions picked up by coenzymes are transferred to the electron transport chain built into the cristae membrane. The electron transport chain carries out oxidative phosphorylation, which accounts for most of the ATP generated by cellular respiration, and finally unites the removed hydrogen with oxygen to form water. The electron transport chain. So the electron transport chain is the big payoff step for ATP production. The hydrogen atoms removed from the first two metabolic phases are loaded with energy, and these hydrogens are delivered by coenzymes to the protein carriers of the electron transport chain, which are embedded in the mitochondrial cristae membranes, as we just talked about. There are hydrogen atoms that are split into hydrogen ions and electrons. The electrons fall down an energy hill, going from each carrier to a carrier of lower energy, like moving water powering a hydroelectric dam. The movement of electrons downhill through the carriers of the electron transport chain powers proton pumps that form a hydrogen ion gradient. Then, as these ions travel down their concentration gradient and through an ATP synthase enzyme, a phosphate is added to ADP to form ATP. Ultimately, free oxygen is reduced. The electrons and hydrogen ions are united with molecular oxygen, forming water and a large amount of ATP. The more complicated process of ATP formation is called oxidative phosphorylation. The beauty of the system is that, unlike the explosive reaction that usually happens when fuels are burned, relatively small amounts of energy are lost as heat or light. So this chart just is pretty handy for summarizing metabolism by body cells. So carbohydrates, so polysaccharides, disaccharides, and monosaccharides. Polysaccharides via digestion turn into simple sugars. Cellular uses, ATP. Some go to the capillary. Excess stored as glycogen or fat, broken down to glucose and released to the blood, again to the capillary, and glycogen and fat broken down for ATP formation. And then fats, composed of one glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acids, triglycerides. GI digestion to turn into fatty acids and glycerol, metabolized by the liver to acetic acid, and function for cellular uses, including the formation of ATP and then myelin sheaths and cell membranes, and function as insulation and fat cushions to protect your body organs. And then proteins, polymers of amino acids. Protein turns into amino acids via GI digestion. Cellular uses are primarily functional proteins like enzymes, antibodies, hemoglobin, and structural proteins like connective tissue fibers and muscle proteins. Infrequently and only when necessary, amino acids are used in ATP formation if glucose and fats are not available or if essential amino acids are lacking. ATP formation fueling the metabolic furnace. All categories of food can be oxidized to provide energy provide energy molecules, so ATP. And cellular metabolic furnace, citric acid side electron transport chain. So we just talked about both of these. Will yield ATP, carbon dioxide, and water. The central role of liver in metabolism. So we know the liver is very important, it's very versatile, it's very complex. Without it, we would die within 24 hours. Its role in digestion, so manufacturing bile, is important to the digestive process, to be sure, but is only one of many functions of liver cells. The liver cells detoxify drugs, alcohol, degrade hormones, and make many substances vital to the body as a whole, like cholesterol, blood proteins such as albumin and clotting proteins, and lipoproteins. They play a central role in metabolism as they process nearly every class of nutrient. Because of liver's key roles, nature has provided us with a surplus of liver tissue. We have much more than we need, and even if part of it is damaged or removed, it is one of the few body organs that can regenerate rapidly and easily. A unique circulation, the hepatic portal circulation, which we've talked about before, brings nutrient-rich blood draining from the digestive viscera directly to the liver. The liver is the body's major metabolic organ, and this detour that nutrients take through the liver ensures that the liver's needs will be met first. As blood circulates through the liver cells remove amino acids, fatty acids, and glucose from the blood. These nutrients are stored for later use or processed in various ways. At the same time, hepatic macrophages remove and destroy bacteria that have managed to get through the walls of the digestive tract and into the blood. General metabolic functions. Excuse me. The liver is vitally important in helping to maintain the blood glucose level within the normal range. After a carbohydrate-rich meal, thousands of glucose molecules are removed from the blood and combined to form the large polysaccharide molecules called glycogen, which are then stored in the liver. This process is glycogenesis, literally meaning glycogen formation. Later, as the body cells continue to remove glucose from the blood to meet their needs, the blood glucose levels begin to drop. At this time, liver cells break down the stored glycogen by a process called glycogenolysis, meaning glycogen splitting, and the liver cells then release glucose bit by bit to the blood to maintain that blood glucose homeostasis. If necessary, the liver can make glucose from non-carbohydrate substances such as fats and proteins. This process is called gluconeogenesis, which means formation of new sugar. Hormones such as thyroxine, insulin, and glucagon are vitally important to controlling blood sugar level and in handling glucose in all body cells. So you can kind of see here in the image, this is the metabolic events occurring in the liver as blood glucose levels rise and fall. So we've kind of talked about this a little bit when we were talking about the endocrine chapter. Let's talk a little about cholesterol metabolism and transport. So although it's a very important lipid in the diet, as we mentioned, cholesterol is not used as energy fuel. Instead, it serves as a structural basis of steroid hormones and vitamin D and is a major building block of plasma membranes. Because we hear so much about cutting down on cholesterol intake, it may be surprising to learn that only 15% of blood cholesterol comes from the diet. The other 85% or so is made by the liver. Cholesterol is lost from the body when it is broken down and secreted in bile salts, which eventually leave the body in feces. Excuse me. Fatty acids, fats, and cholesterol are insoluble in water, so they cannot circulate freely in the bloodstream. Instead, they are transported bound to the small lipid protein complexes called lipoproteins. Although the entire story is complex, the important thing to know is that low-density lipoproteins, or LDLs, transport cholesterol and other lipids to body cells, where they're used in various ways. If large amounts of LDLs are circulating, the chance that fatty substances will be deposited on the arterial walls, initiating atherosclerosis, is high. Because of this possibilities, LDLs are unkindly tagged as bad lipoproteins. By contrast, the lipoproteins that transport cholesterol from tissue cells or arteries to the liver for disposal in bile are high-density lipoproteins, or HDLs. A high HDL level is considered quote-unquote good because the cholesterol is destined to be broken down and eliminated from the body. Obviously, both LDLs and HDLs are good and necessary. It is just their relative ratio in the blood that determines whether or not the potentially lethal cholesterol deposits are likely to be laid in the arterial walls. Metabolic rate and body heat production. So body energy balance. Carbs and protein yield about 4 calories a gram per gram, or 4 kilocalories per gram, and fat yields 9 kilocalories per gram. Sorry, I'm having trouble saying that word. Basic metabolic rate, or the BMR, is the amount of heat produced by a body per unit of time under its basal conditions, being at rest. Factors that influence BMR include surface area, so large surface area in relation to body volume, as in thin, small individuals, increase BMR. Small surface area in relation to body volume, as in large, heavy individuals, decrease BMR. Sex, male, increase, female, decrease. Thyroxine production, increase BMR, decrease production, decrease BMR. Age, young, rapid growth, increase BMR. Aging, elderly, low BMR. Strong emotions, anger or fear, and infections lead to increased BMR. Total metabolic rate. So when we're active, the body must oxidize more glucose to provide energy for the additional activities. Digesting food and even modest physical activity increase the body's caloric requirements dramatically. These additional fuel requirements are above and beyond the energy required to maintain the body in the basal state. So total metabolic rate refers to the total amount of kilocalories the body must consume to fuel all ongoing activities. Body temperature regulation. So we see homeostasis in the center here is normal body temperature. So 35.6 degrees Celsius to 37.8 degrees Celsius. So the stimulus being, if we do the top circle first, increased body temperature. So when exercising, you're in hot weather, blood becomes warmer than the hypothalamic set point, which activates heat loss centers in the hypothalamus. A couple things happen. Sweat glands are activated, skin blood vessels dilate, capillaries become flush with warm blood, and heat radiates from the skin surface to try to rid the body of some of that heat. And as a result, the body temperature begins to decrease back to that hypothalamic set point, shutting the hypothalamus off as we reach homeostasis. And the opposite way down, decreased body temperature due to cold environmental temperatures, body cooler than the hypothalamic set point, which activates heat promoting centers in the hypothalamus, including skin blood vessel constriction. So blood is diverted from skin capillaries and withdrawn to deeper tissues, minimizing that overall heat loss. Skeletal muscles are activated when more heat must be generated, and things like shivering begin. As body temperature increases back up to our homeostatic set point, the hypothalamus shuts off those heat promoting mechanisms. Some of the homeostatic imbalances, hopefully not too familiar to you here, but frostbite. So a condition in which cells become so cold that they develop internal ice crystals and are deprived of oxygen and nutrients and begin to die. So really not great. Hypothermia is just subnormal body temperature, so prolonged exposure to cold and extremely low body temperature. Hyperthermia, high body temperature, so basically the polar opposite of hypothermia. Heat stroke, the failure of the heat regulating ability of an individual under heat stress. It can be fatal unless rapid corrective measures are taken immediately, so things like immersion in cool water, administration of fluids. And then heat exhaustion is collapse, so the actual collapse due to overheating, especially during or after physical activity. Developmental aspects of the digestive system and metabolism. So by the 5th week of development, the alimentary canal a continuous tube-like structure extending from the mouth to the anus. All nutrients, while in utero, are received via the placenta. In the newborn, we'll see a couple different things. We'll see the rooting reflex, which helps infants find the nipple or of the mother or the bottle. The sucking reflex, which helps him or her hold on to the nipple and swallow. The stomach of an infant is very small, so feeding is frequent every 3 to 4 hours, and peristalsis is rather inefficient, so vomiting is not unusual. Teething begins around 6 months and continues until about 2 years of age. During that interval, the infant progresses to more and more solid foods and usually is eating an adult diet by toddlerhood. By that, it means the same foods that the adults are eating. Appetite decreases in elementary school age children and then increases again during that rapid growth of adolescence. All through childhood and into adulthood, the digestive system usually operates with relatively few problems unless there are abnormal interferences such as contaminated foods, extremely spicy or irritating foods. Between middle age and early old age, the metabolic rate decreases by 5 to 8% in every 10-year period. This is the time when the weight seems to creep up and obesity often becomes a fact of life. To maintain desired weight, we must be aware of this gradual change and be prepared for a reduced caloric intake. Two distinctively middle-aged digestive problems are ulcers and gallbladder problems. For some reason, IBS or irritable bowel syndrome, which is characterized by alternating bouts of diarrhea and constipation, is becoming much more prevalent in adults, but its cause has been difficult to pin down. During old age, activity of the GI tract declines, fewer digestive juices are produced, and peristalsis slows. Taste and smell become less acute, periodontal disease often develops. Many elderly individuals live alone or on a reduced income, so with all these factors coming together, food becomes less appealing, nutrition usually is inadequate, and there are a couple homeostatic imbalances I want to talk about here. So the first being tracheoesophageal fistula. So this is a congenital defect in which the esophagus and trachea are connected physically. The esophagus often ends in a blind sac that does not lead to the stomach. So that's an obvious problem. In addition, it'll cause the baby to choke, to drool, to become cyanotic during feedings because the food is entering the respiratory passages. It can be corrected surgically. Then we have cystic fibrosis, which primarily affects the lungs, but is also significantly impairs the activity of the pancreas. In CF, huge amounts of mucus are produced, which block the passages of involved organs. And blockage of the pancreatic duct prevents pancreatic fluid from reaching the small intestine. As a result, fats and fat-soluble vitamins are not digested or absorbed, and bulky fat-laden stools result. This is usually handled by administering pancreatic enzymes with meals. PKU, phenylketonuria, involves the inability of tissue cells to use phenylalanine, which is an amino acid present in all protein foods. In such cases, brain damage and intellectual dysfunction occurs unless a special diet low in phenylalanine is prescribed. Gastroenteritis is just inflammation of the gastrointestinal tract. And then we have appendicitis, which is inflammation of the appendix, which is particularly common in teenagers for some unknown reason. Let's take a closer look at peptic ulcers. So typically round, sharp defined craters 1 to 4 centimeters in diameter in the mucosa of any part of the GI tract exposed to secretions of the stomach. So most occur in the pyloric part of the stomach, gastric ulcers, or the first part of the duodenum, duodenal ulcers. Peptic ulcers may appear at any age, but they develop most frequently between ages of 50 and 70. Duodenal ulcers are about 3 times more common than gastric ulcers. Gastric and duodenal ulcers may produce a gnawing or burning epigastric pain that seems to bore through to your back. Other symptoms include loss of appetite, bloating, nausea, and vomiting. Not all people with ulcers experience these symptoms, however, and some exhibit no symptoms at all. Although a stressful lifestyle does seem to aggravate existing ulcers, Recent studies indicate that most such ulcers are caused by a strain of acid-resistant bacteria, Helicobacter pylori, that burrow through the mucus coat of the stomach, leaving unprotected areas. This corkscrew-shaped bacterium, which you can see in the bottom picture here, is found in the stomachs of 50% of healthy people and 70 to 90% of people with ulcers. So peptic ulcers can produce serious complications, including bleeding, anemia, scarring, obstruction of the pyloric opening, and perforation, which is leakage of stomach and duodenal contents into the peritoneal cavity. Treatment begins with avoiding things like smoking, alcohol, especially wine, ibuprofen, and aspirin, all because they aggravate the ulcers. Antacid drugs are suggested to neutralize stomach acids. In ulcers colonized by H. pylori, a simple 2-week regimen of antibiotics permanently cures nearly all such patients. For active ulcers, a histamine blocker, which is a medication that suppresses acid production in the stomach, can be combined with antibiotic therapy to speed recovery. Recent animal trials using a newly developed vaccine against H. pylori have been very successful. Preventative vaccination coupled with antibiotic cures may eradicate peptic ulcers within the next 25 years. So just to review some of the essentials, peptic ulcer is damage to the stomach mucosa caused by exposure to stomach secretions. So it's when those secretions that are meant to break down food actually begin to break down the actual GI tract tissue itself. Ulcers in the duodenum are 3 times more common than those in the pylorus of the stomach, and most ulcers are caused by H. pylori. Let's also take a closer look at obesity. So the most common view of obesity is that it is a condition of excessive fat storage. So a body fat content that is 18 to 22% of body weight, males and females respectively, is considered normal for adults. Anything over that is defined as obesity. So it doesn't take into things like dense bones or well-developed muscles, which can technically contribute to a person being overweight. Body fat content can be estimated using the BMI scale, body mass index, which is just an index of the person's weight relative to height. BMI equals weight divided by height in inches squared times 703. So a BMI of 25 or more is defined as overweight. BMI of 30 or above is defined as obese. BMI is really nifty because it is very quick, it's inexpensive, but it's not diagnostic. In other words, BMI does not measure body composition directly. So a high BMI does not necessarily represent a health crisis. There are other methods of body measurement composition that are better measurements of potential or actual disease. So air displacement plethysmography technology, aka the BOD pod, is a way of measuring body composition using air displacement to determine body volume and thus body density. Density meaning mass or weight divided by volume. There also exists a similar technology that uses a water-filled rather than an air-filled chamber. Both of these are more accurate than BMI, but they are more expensive and less readily available to the general population. However it is defined, obesity is poorly understood, despite its adverse effects on health. So people do have a higher incidence of arteriosclerosis, hypertension, coronary artery disease, and diabetes. It is the most common health problem in the United States. According to the CDC, 42.4% of adults and about 18.5% of all youths ages 2 to 19 are obese. Overeating, consuming fried or processed foods, and sedentary activities such as video gaming or watching television have replaced healthy eating and exercise for some people. So the essentials are BMI can estimate body fat but is not diagnostic. BMI does not measure body composition directly. Over 42% of adults in the U.S. are obese, and it is associated with higher incidence of arteriosclerosis, hypertension, and diabetes mellitus. Any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me.